conspiracy beliefs and conspiracy believers disregard the evidence or reframe the evidence in a way where it's not harmful to the belief. More recently, Napolitano has proposed a different construal of this core feature, in which she labels as evidential insulation, where she claims that conspiracy believers simply don't take the evidence into account at all. So let me just put some more flesh on these core features with regards to the monological view and the claim that these beliefs form monological networks. As I said, there's been consistent findings which show that those who believe in one conspiracy theory are more likely to believe in others. The monological thought view then claims that beliefs in conspiracy theories directly support one another to form a kind of a self-sustaining network. And this view has been introduced into the literature by Goerzel. Actually, Goerzel the son and Goerzel the father, both of whom have tried to flesh out the idea of monological belief systems, one from the perspective of computer science and research on AI, the other one from the perspective of sociology and psychology. So Ben Goerzel writes that a monological belief system is a belief system which speaks only to itself, ignoring its context in all but the shallowest respects. So in a sense, a monological reasoning style or belief system is somewhat metaphorically similar to having a monologue. And Ted Goerzel writes that in a monological belief system, each of the beliefs serves as evidence for each of the other beliefs. So as I said before, the monological view has recently been reframed in terms of what is called the higher order beliefs about conspiracies. And this is mostly supported in reference to a study done by Wood et al. In 2012, where the authors write, the monological nature of conspiracy beliefs appears to be driven not by conspiracy theories directly supporting one another, but by broader beliefs supporting conspiracy beliefs in general. So the idea here and the findings of that study were that people can endorse mutually inconsistent conspiracy beliefs in mutually inconsistent conspiracy scenarios. For example, that Princess Diana faked her own death and that she was murdered. Even though there's a high probability that a person who endorses one of these hypotheses endorses the other, these hypotheses are only related insofar as they are independently supported by a broader, higher order belief that makes them consistent. For example, the belief that there is a cover-up. And here we should stress that the higher orderedness of this claim is kind of contentious and a bit of a misnomer, because really what the authors are claiming is that particular beliefs in conspiracy theories are consistent with more general or broad beliefs about there being a cover-up or some kind of a conspiracy, and this is kind of predictive of people endorsing these more particular beliefs. Yeah, so these, as Douglas writes and colleagues write, the higher order beliefs are predictive of the endorsement of more detailed, sometimes contradictory beliefs. So that's the claim about the higher orderedness. And now moving to this confirmation and insensitivity to evidence, the early view proposed by Keeley was that all potentially falsifying evidence can be construed as supporting or at worst as neutral evidence by a conspiracy theory supporter. And this view, to be honest, wasn't really fleshed out completely. More recently, Napolitano has labeled this view, framed it in a probabilistic way, and labeled this as probabilistic in irrelevance condition, which is the label we'll go with here. And she says basically this: a piece of evidence is probabilistically irrelevant to a hypothesis if it is assigned the same probability given that the hypothesis is true or that it is false. So one thing to note at this point is that probabilistic irrelevance in this sense is different from probabilistic independence. So the two notions shouldn't be confused here, because here what we're really interested in this framing of the condition is the relationship, right, between the evidence and some set of competing hypotheses. Okay. And Napolitano is critical of this view. She suggests that in order to fulfill this condition, a hypothesis would have to be so general that it would fail to produce any kind of predictions. And this is what she takes to be a problem, because for her it's unlikely and it's difficult to see how agents could acquire such super general and non-predictive beliefs. And in response to this objection that she levels against the probabilistic irrelevance condition, she introduces her own view, which she calls the evidential insulation view. And on this view, conspiracy theoretic beliefs are isolated from disconfirming evidence. And it's not the relationship among conspiracy beliefs that is crucial for Napolitano, and for the irrationality, or it's the source of irrationality of such beliefs, but it is the way in which their associated credence is or is not updated when disconfirming evidence is presented. And Napolitano also says that an agent's degree of belief in a conspiracy theory does not seem to change regardless of whether disconfirming observations are taken to bear on the belief. So she thinks that these beliefs are kind of insulated or in a kind of evidential bubble where they do not admit being, for example, conditioned on the evidence. Okay, so these are kind of the four proposals, more particular proposals that are on the table. And all these views have some commonalities, right? So the key similarities here really are the fact that they all analyze conspiracy beliefs through the lens of flawed reasoning processes. They assume that these processes are insensitive to disconfirming evidence in some way. They place special importance on the notion of consistency and inconsistency between the beliefs and the evidence. And finally, they also have a commonality which is kind of negative, which is that they share a critical flaw. And this critical flaw is that despite of their focus on doxastic processes which are involved in producing and sustaining beliefs in conspiracy theories, neither of the views actually offers a model or a formal analysis of these processes. And we actually think that this is a bit of a problem, and it's actually a problem that has been acknowledged in the psychological literature, where several papers, including the meta-review I indicated earlier, raise the question about a lack of theory surrounding conspiracy theoretic beliefs, or a lack of some kind of model of their acquisition and their revision. And in the absence of a formal model, basically we don't know two things. We don't know to what extent these positions are related, or sometimes they're framed as competing views, as I've just presented. So it could be the case that they're not competing at all. The second problem is that there's also no account for why or how certain beliefs exhibit these particular features. So for example, just to point out Napolitano's view, if Napolitano claims that conspiracy theoretic beliefs are insulated from any evidence, then she kind of owes us a story about why or how certain beliefs can exhibit such a puzzling feature. And without a model, without a kind of constructive proposal about where this comes from, a systematic proposal that can be investigated and experimented on, we're not really moving towards understanding conspiracy beliefs that much. So in this, keeping all of this in mind, we can think about what we're trying to do in this paper. So first, we want to use a probabilistic control of beliefs to arrive at a position which unifies and builds on the accounts presented. We want to offer an account of how agents fail to update their beliefs in light of this confirming evidence. And finally, we are interested in providing some kind of a formal platform for modeling and comparing different views with regard to conspiracy beliefs. And this basically takes us to the second part of this talk, where we will discuss viewing conspiracy beliefs and conspiracy theoretic beliefs through a Bayesian lens. So there's a early proposal, again, by Clark from 2002, who proposed a view on which conspiracy theories may be similar to Lakatosh's degenerating research programs. So I'm sure most of the people here are familiar with degenerating research programs, but just very briefly, Lakatosh proposed that a research program will have a hard core of theoretical assumptions that cannot be abandoned or altered without abandoning the program altogether. Just like conspiracy theories often have some kind of a hard core of assumptions about there being a conspiracy or a cover-up or something like that that cannot be abandoned. But then a Lakatoshian research program also has a protective belt of auxiliary hypotheses which can absorb evidential disconfirmation of the core hypotheses and can be revised in order to produce more empirical predictions and stuff like that. And obviously, this is also something that's compatible with conspiracy theories. One problem that is noted by Clark in his paper already is that Lakatosh doesn't provide very strict criteria for when a research program turns to be from a productive or successful to a degenerating one. And it's actually kind of imprecise distinction. Fortunately, recently in the literature, there was a proposal by Strevens who proposed to formalize kind of this core periphery structure between hypotheses in a Bayesian way. And this has been picked up more recently by Gershman, who took this proposal on board to model the relations between different types of cognitive processes and different types of beliefs. And here we are interested in adopting this proposal to talk about conspiratorial beliefs in particular. So just to maybe consider a particular example of a conspiracy theory before we move on, one popular conspiracy trope is the idea that there's a conspiracy surrounding the death of Lady Diana, either that she hasn't died in the car accident or that she was assassinated. And for example, for someone who believes that Lady Diana actually faked her own death, proponents of such a belief, agents endorsing such a belief or proponents of such a conspiracy theory have to be confronted with the fact that her funeral was public and there were photos of the accident, which we of course won't show you now, but there seems to be a lot of evidence to disconfirm the hypothesis that she has actually escaped death. So if we model this kind of set of beliefs about Princess Diana through the lens of Strevens and Gershman's proposal, then we get a structure which is a little bit like this. We have a central hypothesis H, that there is a conspiracy surrounding Diana's death. There's an auxiliary hypothesis A, that she faked her own death to get away from fame. Then there's a conjunct HA, which entails a prediction P, right? That Princess Diana is still alive. And of course, a piece of evidence E, which contradicts the prediction, such as public funeral photos. And basically, you might already see that there is a similarity here with the Quine-Duhem problem in philosophy of science, right? So it makes sense to think that this confirmatory evidence E undermines the conjunct of the central hypothesis and the auxiliary hypothesis, but this says nothing about whether the auxiliary or the central hypothesis are refuted or undermined by the disconfirmatory evidence. In other words, the distribution of blame between the beliefs is underdetermined in this case. So what we want to propose and what we want to discuss is this idea of Bayesian blame shifting. So formally, we can model the relationship between the degrees of belief in the conjunct HA upon receiving some disconfirmatory evidence with Bayes' theorem. I'm sure everyone here is familiar with Bayes' theorem, right? Here's the theorem with the values from our example plugged in already. So where the posterior probability of a conjunct hypothesis given the disconfirmatory evidence, what it is, depends on the following: the likelihood of observing the evidence given the conjunct hypothesis of our hypotheses, right? That Princess Diana faked her own death, and the auxiliary, the prior probability of the conjunct regardless of the disconfirmatory evidence, and the marginal likelihood given by the sum of the likelihoods and priors associated with the conjunct and those associated with its negation. I mean, this is pretty standard Bayesian stuff. What's interesting also about Bayesian methods is that Bayesian methods actually allow us to extract the conditional probabilities of the central hypothesis given the evidence and the auxiliary hypothesis given the evidence in order to calculate how much of the blame for the evidence is carried by each of these beliefs. And the blame for this confirming evidence should be apportioned relative to the prior probabilities assigned to the central hypothesis and to the auxiliary hypothesis, in such a way that the higher the prior of one of these hypotheses, the prior is, so the prior for the central hypothesis is, the less the central hypothesis will be blamed to the disfavor of the auxiliary when the conjunct is underdetermined, right? So just to repeat that, just to be very clear, the higher the prior probability in the central hypothesis, the more blame gets shifted to the auxiliary hypothesis when the conjunct of the central and the auxiliary hypotheses is undermined. And conversely, if the auxiliary hypothesis is already highly probable, has a high prior, the blame is put on the central hypothesis. And so the negative impact of the evidence on the central hypothesis increases relative to the certainty or the credence, prior credence in A. And finally, as the probability of the auxiliary hypothesis conditional on the central hypothesis increases, the probability of the set of alternative auxiliarities relative to the central hypothesis will also decrease. So this is also a standard idea in Bayesian reasoning, right? That if, and Bayesian calculus, that if we have a set of auxiliary hypotheses, then if one hypothesis is kind of favored as is the favored auxiliary, then the probability of the other hypotheses will diminish to some extent. And here we have a very nice graph from Gershman's paper, which basically shows us the relationship between these values and the prior probability of the strength of the prior belief in the central hypothesis. So here you can see that if the prior belief in the central hypothesis is very high, this will actually lead to shifting more blame towards the auxiliary, because if the prior in the central hypothesis is high, then the central hypothesis will actually accept very little disconfirmation. However, this of course will change in the case that the probability of the auxiliary hypothesis increases significantly. And we can also come back to this in the discussion. So this is kind of what we call Bayesian blame shifting, right? If the prior of for the, as I said just now, just to repeat it once again, if the prior for the central hypothesis is high, probability should be shifted away from the auxiliary upon encountering this confirmatory evidence. And a central hypothesis with a high prior probability relative to the auxiliary hypothesis will be relatively robust to this confirmation. And I already said this, that the auxiliary might have sufficiently high prior probability. If that's the case, then the central hypothesis will be forced to absorb the blame. Okay, so how does any of this relate to the views about conspiracy beliefs that we've just presented to you? Well, first of all, it's kind of compatible with the monological view. So if the central hypothesis and the set of auxiliary, if we take the central hypothesis and the set of auxiliary hypothesis A, they will form a kind of a network in which credence and the impact of the evidence are distributed across them, right? And auxiliaries will mutually constrain each other since they cannot be all true in light of the evidence. The stipulation of the central hypothesis directly raises the probability of certain auxiliary hypotheses and decreases the probability of alternatives conjoined with the central hypothesis. And new auxiliaries will be considered or adopted insofar as they are compatible with the central hypothesis. That is, if the probability of the new auxiliary given the central hypothesis divided by the prior of the central hypothesis is sufficiently high. Okay. Again, the choice of auxiliaries is guided by the core beliefs that are often more general in scope and less prone to disconfirmation, which is something that we would also expect in the higher order treatment of conspiracy beliefs that I presented at the beginning of our talk. So this means that increase in incremental confirmation can make broad beliefs central or higher order over time, to use the nomenclature of Douglas and co-authors. And such beliefs also serve the purpose of reconciling mutually inconsistent auxiliaries in the following sense, that the probability of some auxiliary A, such as Diana faked her death, given the central hypothesis that there is a conspiracy surrounding Diana's death, and the probability in a different auxiliary that Diana was murdered, and the same central hypothesis that there is a conspiracy, will be both relatively high. However, the probabilities of the two auxiliary hypotheses conditioned on each other will approximate or tend towards zero, right? So the condition that Diana was murdered, given that Diana faked her death, is zero. And this is something that is actually visible in the data gathered by Wood et al. And we can also discuss that in the Q&A. Furthermore, this view puts an interesting light on this insensitivity to disconfirmation of conspiracy beliefs, because it makes this insensitivity to this confirmation somewhat limited. So as per Clark's 2002 suggestion, the protective belt of auxiliary beliefs can absorb this confirmatory evidence and insulate the central belief from revisions if the conjunct of the central and the auxiliary is falsified by or undermined by some negative evidence. Then the central hypothesis can be protected from refutation by simply replacing the auxiliary hypothesis with an alternative one, which is not inconsistent with this confirmatory evidence, right? So for example, the auxiliary "she faked her death to get away from fame" can be replaced with an auxiliary such that Diana was murdered. And this obviously protects the central hypothesis, because the hypothesis or the belief that there is a conspiracy surrounding Diana's death is protected. Furthermore, together with the new auxiliary, it will generate new predictions consistent with the previously disconfirmatory evidence, right? So the funeral photos. So this is kind of also speaks to folding in the ideas from Keeley that conspiracy theories and conspiracy theoretic beliefs allow for reconstruing the evidence in such a way that it doesn't harm the central belief in a conspiracy. And all of this also points to the fact that self-insulation appears to be a matter of degree when it comes to conspiracy theories. Okay, so now some implications for the rationality of conspiracy beliefs, because some of you might start to worry at this point that we're talking about Bayesian, analyzing conspiracy beliefs in a Bayesian way, and suddenly it looks like, you know, believing that the Earth is flat, or that, you know, there's Nazis hiding on the dark side of the moon. Suddenly, it seems like we're saying that these beliefs are rational. So what are the implications of this approach for the rationality of conspiracy beliefs and conspiracy theoretic beliefs? Well, apparent resistance to belief revision given disconfirming evidence complies with Bayesian norms of reasoning. This is all that we said so far. And therefore, it's not always irrational for a conspiracy theories to shift probability away from an auxiliary hypothesis in order to protect some central belief. If the prior for the central hypothesis is sufficiently high, its protection given disconfirming evidence, it can be protected given disconfirming evidence by replacing the auxiliary with a consistent alternative, right? So this is in principle admissible according to the norms of Bayesian probability theory and the picture that we've painted here. And so the blame here, right, is that the problem kind of with conspiratorial beliefs is the problem stemming from the fact that these beliefs seem to be seem to be surrounded by a protective belt of auxiliary hypotheses that can be recycled and abandoned, rather than some kind of a problem with updating one's belief in response to disconfirming evidence. And again, what will count as counter evidence, according to this view, will depend on the beliefs held in the first place. So depending on what's your central belief and your auxiliaries, you might reconstruct the evidence as relevant or irrelevant, for example. So if you assume an auxiliary belief, the public media is unreliable, it will be consistent to infer that the evidence of funeral photos is not really relevant, for example, because the photos are fake, right? So this will again support the central hypothesis that there is some kind of a conspiracy theory surrounding Diana's death, and the auxiliary that she has faked her death. Okay, so I see that I'm kind of low on time, so maybe I'll skip a few slides, or maybe I'll just continue, but just very quickly. So to give you a familiar example that everyone has heard about, you know, there's a popular conspiracy theory that Elvis faked his own death as well. And in the case of this kind of absorption of beliefs into a protective belt, people who are presented with a photo of Elvis dismiss this evidence because they actually think that, you know, they have some kind of auxiliary beliefs that allow them to shift their attention and also dismiss the evidence in such a way that they will not take the photo of Elvis in a casket as evidence of his death. Instead, they will take photos like the one on the right as evidence that Elvis is still alive and well, right? So here you can see that two kinds of evidence that depending on your prior beliefs and your auxiliary beliefs, will either one of them will seem obviously fake. It just depends what your auxiliaries, so to speak, are and what is the structure of your doxastic system. Okay. But it's not the case that belief protection is always admissible. So Strevens distinguishes between two ways of rescuing a central belief from disconfirmation, which he calls glorious and desperate rescue. So a glorious rescue is the rescue wherein the auxiliary belief is specifically called to protect the central belief. However, this belief has been well confirmed in the past. And he gives an example of Neptune's discovery. Neptune was postulated as an eighth planet to rescue Newton's theory of universal gravitation in light of deviations of the planetary motions that were observed at the time. There were many people who thought that postulating an extra planet is kind of a desperate move, but it was vindicated after all, precisely because Newton's theory has been much better confirmed at the time of postulating Neptune's existence than any other theory at the time. So it was more justifiable to kind of protect the theory than to abandon it just because it cannot account for some aberrant data. On the other hand, Strevens distinguishes what he calls desperate rescues, and desperate rescues happen when the relation between the central and the auxiliary belief becomes ad hoc. The auxiliary belief is specifically called to rescue a central belief by accommodating the disconfirmatory evidence while not being well entrenched. So here, entrenched is simply taken to mean that the past evidential and predictive, for example, record of a central hypothesis is poor. And to give you an example again, to bring it back to our example from earlier, the auxiliary hypothesis that Diana was murdered is specifically called to protect the belief that there is a conspiracy surrounding her death. And this hypothesis might make a new prediction that there is a murderer of Diana, right? So it's not entirely degenerating in Lakatoshian terms. But it's associated central belief that there is a conspiracy surrounding Diana's death is not well entrenched. It doesn't have a good track record. It doesn't have a lot of positive evidence, and because there's simply very little confirmation that has been accumulated over time. Interesting, though, on this view, whether we have a case of a glorious instead of a desperate rescue can only be determined after the fact or retrospectively. Many glorious rescues seem desperate at one point in time throughout history. Here's one of the favorite examples from conspiracy theoretic literature is obviously the Watergate scandal. So the central hypothesis that there is a conspiracy surrounding a break-in to the Democratic National Committee headquarters had the auxiliary that the break-in was perpetrated by members of Nixon's administration. And then, of course, proponents of this, investigators of this claim faced the evidence that the administration denied any involvement. And so they revised their belief system, so to speak, or admitted a new auxiliary that there's a systematic cover-up by the Nixon administration to protect the idea that the hypothesis about the break-in is plausible. And again, they encountered new evidence in the end that the Oval Office tapes, which revealed that actually there was a conspiracy. And that, together with other evidence that was being accumulated after that, shows us that in the Watergate scandal, holding on to the central hypothesis and revising the auxiliary was a case of glorious rescue. And in that case, it's a glorious rescue specifically because the accumulated confirmation for the central hypothesis outweighs the cost of lowering the evidence in the auxiliary hypothesis. Okay. So I will now move on to briefly mention possible sources of irrationality of conspiracy beliefs, even though that's not really our main target in the paper. But given everything that I've said, it's also interesting to think how could it be that that belief systems operated in such a way that they can occupy spaces where or form networks of beliefs such that they become that they take on these characteristics. So in Bayesian cognitive sciences, some constraints that could explain why sometimes people hang on to evidentially inferior hypothesis has emerged. One proposal are the so-called intuitive theories, which are the learned implicit auxiliary beliefs about the data gathering processes. This has been proposed and studied by Tenenbaum and his people. So we also see this in the literature and with qualitative evidence, like interviews with conspiracy theory supporters, that they often appeal to how things should make intuitive sense to them, how they think things work or should work, rather than actually paying attention to real world processes and how complicated they sometimes are. Secondly, there's an assumption of sparsity, which has been, for example, endorsed by Gershman in his paper. So this sparsity means that the system endorses auxiliary hypotheses that generate narrow predictions. And in the extreme case, auxiliary hypotheses that will predict all and only the observed data, that will have basically very narrow scopes. And there's some evidence for that in the psychological literature. For example, most people asked to generate number concepts from the range from 1 to 1,000 mention just prime numbers. So they actually make a very, they choose a very specific kind of prediction, right? A very unique token. Another feature of these systems is, or assumption that is sometimes adopted, again, Gershman adopts it, is determinism. So a preference to place all weight on only a few beliefs consistent with the data, so that the probability of the data given the conjunct will be near to 1. In the extreme case, this will mean that people will only adopt auxiliaries that perfectly predict the observed data and select them. And the rationale here is that belief networks that predict only a few possible events must assign each a higher probability for the distribution to sum up to 1. And together, if we join sparsity and determinism, this can lead to singling out one factor as the only true cause. And this has also been proposed before in the literature on conspiracy theories, that conspiracy theory believers have a certain bias towards explanations which undermine, for example, environmental factors and amplify one particular sort of agency as the true cause of very complicated and complex events. And finally, the other feature of Bayesian systems in general is Occam's razor. Beliefs that are too sparse fixed are unlikely to generate future observations. Beliefs that are too flexible can generate many possible data sets, but they are unlikely to generate a particular data set at random. So there's this idea that Bayesian systems will optimize in a way where they will prefer sets of hypotheses that generalize well to unobserved data and don't overfit to particular data. And you can also see that if this is in general the case with Bayesian systems, that they favor these kinds of sets of beliefs or hypotheses, then this pulls the system in one direction, whereas sparsity and determinism pulls the system in a completely different direction. And it's possible that given, very complex psychological features of humans, there will be cases where, due to different factors, people get locked in towards or become biased towards one particular criterion here, and this will be responsible for their adoption of conspiratorial beliefs. Okay, so I'm briefly concluding. We have outlined a formal method of modeling different views in conspiracy theoretic beliefs. We have shown that competing accounts of such beliefs, so accounts which focus either on the relationship between the beliefs or their insensitivity to evidence, or seeming insensitivity to evidence, I should say, that these views can actually be brought together under one roof. And we have also proposed that the source of irrationality in conspiracy beliefs does not have to lie in the failure to update these beliefs in light of disconfirming evidence. A possible benchmark for rationality of conspiratorial beliefs has also been proposed. So when we encounter new beliefs or explanations or accounts of events which appeal to the existence of a conspiracy, we should look at the entrenchment of the central hypothesis and the past record of their successful predictions. So this would distinguish or at least let us push us towards looking at a particular belief in a conspiracy as either more likely to be a desperate rescue or a glorious one. So thank you so much for your attention. Thank you for the invitation. And also, once again, thanks to the Volkswagen Stiftung for sponsoring this research.